And Bryson, we're getting ready to kind of move and groove with the next set of fireside chats.
Yep, we've got Jim Webster, who leads product management, and I think it's with Tim Schultz, actually, right?
Or Chris Peacock.
Oh, Chris Peacock. Tim, yep. I was mixing them up. I feel like Tim's later today. Yep. So Chris Peacock. So Jim leads product management at Scythe. He, I think, has the note as the longest serving CISO I've ever met. He was actually a CISO for 10 years running. So fighting that life with the mayfly thing. And then Chris Peacock, who, what are you, an irrational number in the top global Sigma contributors list now? Is that how we're joking about it?
I'm somewhere up there. I try to make sure that we can detect after those control validations that we just talked about. Once something gets through there, what can we do to make sure that we can still detect it before impact? So it's all about those layers, right?
Let me see if I understand this. You mean just finding all of the problems alone isn't good enough?
No, there's a lot of problems, and the problems are at a bunch of different layers.
All right.
I'm sure you can do a whole talk on OT versus IT layers too.
I say some would say that there's a pyramid of the pain.
Well, that's just different layers of threat intelligence. So we have layers on layers. The whole cybersecurity problem is like multiple ogres in one tribe together.
So in other words, job security for some of us, or perhaps not.
We shall see. Anyways, anything else, or are we ready to take it over?
I say rock and roll.
All right. Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Bryson. All right. Welcome, everyone. Happy Friday. Hopefully, because you're here, that means that you're not on an active engagement. You didn't get ransomware this Friday. Congratulations.
It's still early. That happens after Friday afternoon when you're getting ready to go home. Yes.
Around 3 or like
you get that 4:30 call from legal, or you get the victim notification from the FBI.
Yep, I've had those ones where it's like, oh, it hit right at 5, and now we're on a call everyone's on a all hands call at 6 or 7 p.m. going into the weekend. So, anyways, thank you for being here. Happy Friday. If you're just starting the weekend shift because you're that SOC monitor that has to be there for the weekend. Happy Monday. Hope the weekend is light and breezy and easy. With that, who am I? I'm Christopher Peacock. You can call me Chris. I started out at help desk. I worked my way up through doing network administration, system administration, worked my way up through SOCs, got into purple teaming through that avenue. We had pen test, and CISOs like to look good on pen test. So I started making my CISO look good because I would do what the pen testers would do before they came in, make sure we were ready for them. And then that made us look good. So that's kind of how I got into purple teaming. From there, I went from what pen testers were doing to what actual adversaries were doing. And now I'm here at SCYTHE, where I'm the principal detection engineer. With that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Jim to introduce himself briefly.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, so I have probably the non-traditional route to being a CISO. Started out as a software developer, writing code for government customers, and then moved into network engineering, and I was doing security for Y2K, which was a lot of fun. A lot of work, and avoided what could have been a really fun New Year's Eve, but it was very mild, which was good. And then got into network security, and then moved my way up into running SOCs and incident response teams, and ultimately becoming the CISO at Mantech for 10 years. And during that time, I was part of a DIB cybersecurity task force. Was also working with DHS on a sector coordinating council. And then decided it was time, after 10 years of avoiding a resume generating event, that it was time to try new areas, and moved to SCYTHE. And I'm the VP of product, and very excited to help move the product into newer and better things.
All right, thanks, Jim. Hats off, by the way, lasting 10 years in a CISO spot. So my hat is off to you.
Yeah, my peer group, we had a lunch group that got together once a month, and by the time I left Mantech, I was the only one of the original founders that everybody's replacement or multiple replacements, were attending that lunch group.
Nice. All right, so to dive in, current threat landscape. And honestly, this probably isn't actually the current threat landscape at most organizations. If you're very mature, it might be. But we have the blue team, we have the red team, we have the CTI team. From the red team, it could just be something like Atomic Red Team that people are running. From the CTI team, it could just be something like CTI feeds that people are purchasing, which we can kind of get into. Is that cyber threat intelligence, or is that just indicator feeds that have been labeled threat intelligence, so to speak? So the blue team, one of the big things here that we kind of talk about is that we don't actually have times validation. We don't know if we can answer the questions that our leaders are asking us. Can we actually detect our adversary? Do we or do we not? If we don't know where we stand, then we don't know where we need to get to. We don't know what coverage we have. Oftentimes we go in and we ask organizations what their assumptions are that will actually happen. It's amazing to see how expectations do not play out once we actually get into an actual purple team exercise. And then the other thing to consider is, if we do have an alert, what level alert is it? One of the things I like to say is eyeballs on the alert, or it doesn't matter. Because at the end of the day, if we don't have human interaction, I mean, don't get me wrong, we could do some automation to do some automated responses to things. But if we're even doing that, we should still have a human verify that everything was done correctly. We did contain the full scope of the incident. So we need to actually get humans involved in that response process at some point. And then if we do have alerts, or if we have visibility gaps, do we need to do any sort of detection engineering around that? Maybe it's a low-level alert that we need to raise to a high-level alert. Maybe it's an alert that's really noisy, so we're just ignoring it. But we could tune it pretty quickly, and then we could actually respond to it. And then the other area we consider are there logging gaps? Oftentimes, one of the quick ways to actually catch Cobalt Strike is with name pipe creation. There's a few known name pipes that it uses by default. And a lot of times some EDRs or organizations, they don't actually have visibility into the name pipe creation, so they can't deploy that logic. So that's something to consider. Oftentimes too, is your logging working? If we run an emulation that's going to do a DNS call out to a no malicious domain, is your DNS working? Or is your EDR alert actually getting into your security stack right? Just because of an EDR alert trips in the EDR, but it takes 12 hours to get to your SIM, well, you're going to be behind on responding to what could be going towards a ransomware attack. So that's something to consider, is that pipeline as well. With cyber threat intelligence, oftentimes we hear that this is really just focused on hashes and IPs and domain names, and that's just not getting ahead of the adversary. They're changing those very quickly. And if your competitor gets attacked, or someone else in your threat landscape, they're going to rotate those indicators of attack very quickly. And they don't go from one intrusion set to another all the time. So that's one of the areas we see, is that, yeah, we're getting these indicators to compromise them, but we're not making actual threat intelligence actionable for the defenders at the front line, and understanding what our adversaries are doing, and do we have prevention mechanisms or detection mechanisms against them. And then with red team, oftentimes they'll either hide their tricks, they may not replicate what adversaries are actually doing. By the way, Red Canary did a great talk at this at Wild West Hackfest, by the way. Highly recommend it. They actually went in and they looked at the data analysis of, okay, what are actual adversaries doing versus what's Emulation doing, or pen test teams doing, things like that. And they saw how it matched up. And then, like we said before, most organizations actually don't have a red team. So that's something to consider as well. And that's where we see, maybe if you're just starting out, hey, Atomic Red Team is great. That's why they built it. Maybe that's where you start out. So how do we shift this into purple? Well, moving forward, one of the big things that we see is having that threat understanding. You know, one of the big things right now is the ISO smuggling. They put it on to the email, or there's a link in the email. They click the link and it downloads a zip file which contains an ISO, which then gets mounted. And then on top of that, once it's mounted, then they click like an LNK file, which then finally launches a malicious DLL via run DLL32. Ooh, that's exhausting, right? But there's a lot of detection capabilities in there. But we have to know that that's what our threat is doing, so that we can go and we can start doing these prevention policies. Like maybe we should block ISO mounting because that's what our threat is doing currently. And then the detection understanding. So can we detect an ISO is being mounted? Or can we detect run DLL32 making outbound network calls that's indicative of that command and control, that C2 that they've now established on their foothold? So those two things coming together, the threat understanding drives the detection understanding, which then drives the overall purple team collaboration. With threat understanding, you know, what are the procedures that they're doing? Like we said, they're using that ISO and they're mounting it. Then we want to think about, okay, what are procedural variants or variations that they could use? So right now, if when they mount the ISO, when they click that LNK file, maybe right now it launches run DLL32. You know, that's a great one to proxy DLL execution through. Well, if we know that run DLL32 is being used, maybe we can hypothesize that, hey, they might use reg SVR32. Or we can go and we can check the attack framework to see what other applications are used to do DLL execution. Or we can go and we can look at the LawBAS project as well. And then, do we have test coverage of the adversary? That's one of the other areas of the threat understanding, is developing that test coverage. And that's what we do at SCYTHE, is we go out, we understand the adversary, and we develop that test coverage so that we can go out and we can validate preventions and detections. We already went over this. I'll just cover it briefly here. You know, are there visibility gaps? Is it logged? Is it not? Are there detection gaps, or are there not detection gaps? If there are gaps in our detections, what can we do to fix them? That's one of the areas that we want to do in response to eyeballs on alerts. You know, if an alert goes off in the woods and no one's around to hear it, it's not going to get responded to. So we got to make sure that someone's getting a response to what we know will trip when adversaries do what they typically do. Because adversaries have habits, they have training, they are humans just like you and me. And like, thankfully, I don't say anymore. If you would have heard me like a year ago when I started these, I probably said 50 times. But that's the thing. Adversaries have habits. So when they get in an organization, they're going to run similar commands. So we need to focus on detecting those. And then, is the response correct? Oftentimes, oh boy. One of my friends recently, they said, Chris, you won't believe this. And I said, what? I'll probably believe it. They said, you know, we got an alert for malicious PowerShell. And I was like, well, that's interesting. And then they go, yeah. And then the SOC tier 1 marked it as a false positive because of PowerShell is a known good application signed by Microsoft. The hash has 0 hits on virus total. So they marked it as a false positive. So these are things we have to make sure that we're training up our staff. And that also goes back to knowing our threat landscape. If you don't know that malicious PowerShell is a thing, then you're not going to respond appropriately to it. So what that kind of looks like in this nice graph that we have that threat intelligence that's going to drive our attack. And then from there, we can figure out where do we stand, and we can track that. And then we can develop our detect and respond off of that. Some other reasons why we talk about purple teaming: training defenders, right? We want to go ahead and we want people to go through malicious PowerShell alerts. We want to train defenders. We also want to test processes between teams. Sometimes we're doing handoffs. Maybe we're doing elevation from SOC 1 to SOC 2. Maybe we're going to do handoffs from SOC to incident response. Maybe it's dealing with MSSP, and the MSSP has to file a report that then comes to us that then we have to remediate. It just depends. Every organization is unique. They all have their different teams, their different processes. Finally, testing TTPs. You know, that's a huge one. We want to test the known tactics, techniques, and procedures that are out there. And then sometimes if we do have a red team and we have recommendations from that red team, oftentimes we don't want to wait a year for them to come back. So we want to go ahead and replay some of those red team engagement tests so that when they do come back and they try what they did last time, we've fixed them. And now we can keep doing that as iron sharpens iron, man sharpens man, so to speak. And then the big thing is foster collaboration. That's a huge one. So we have a lot of different areas when what's considered cybersecurity, right? I'm sure, Jim, you're familiar with all these areas coming from the CISO realm, but what we're kind of focused on here is that SecOps, that security operations. And what CTI, what any sort of adversary emulation and any sort of security operations, SOC, detection engineering, all that kind of falls into the prevention, detection, and response cycle, that security operations cycle. So that's just something to consider. Does it fall into reduce risk management? Yes. Jim, I'll leave that up to you of how you want to quantify how catching who am I early in an attack chain, how you quantify that. That's above my payroll. But for here, we're focusing on that SecOps. And one of the big things that we see is shifting left of boom. So when we talk about boom, right, I'm not talking about CIA, the spy agency and stuff like that. We're talking about confidentiality, integrity, availability of the data. So we want to catch adversaries before that impact. It's one of those things, prevention is nice, but detection is a must. I'm here to tell you, look, if prevention actually works, don't get me wrong, definitely do prevention. Do it as well as you can, but be ready for when it does fail. And I'll tell you this, because if prevention was actually solved, most of us would not have jobs. We would install the firewall, the AV, and we'd call it a day because no adversary would ever get onto a network if prevention worked. So let's layer up as much as we can, but let's realize that stuff does get through.
And I think real quick, just a footstop something that Bryson said earlier in his keynote rant. Dwell time is the most important metric. The longer the adversary has with unfettered access to move around the network, the more damage they're going to do. So moving this to as close to that initial breach as we can is critical, because we need to get them off the network. And no, exactly, when you look at who am I and the basic steps, reconnaissance steps an adversary does when they get it on an endpoint, you need to identify those and elevate them very quickly so you can stop it before they get to the point where they put their full C2 stack in your environment.
Oh, 100%. And one thing I always say is incident response is a lot cheaper if you catch it on the first box, because the moment it laterally moves, your instant response cost skyrockets. So that's just something to consider. So focusing on this area is huge. Like we said, we have to have layers. Another way of putting this, Red Canary had a great report they put out this year. The link's down here. Oh, I can't copy and paste because I'm in presenter mode. Try to get it out later. But they actually said we focus on trying to detect ransomware precursor activity. And if we look up here, we see the initial access, the recon, the lateral movement. And they focus there to avoid the exfiltration and the encryption, the badness. And they say we see many more so-called ransomware precursors than we do actual ransomware. Because what they're doing is they're finding the actors before impact, and that reduces costs. So when we're also talking about doing testing, we talk about assume breach. Don't get me wrong. Make sure you don't have single factor VPN. Make sure you don't have RDP open, and you must have patch management, because if you have something open that's vulnerable, it's going to get popped. That's just the nature of being on the internet now. So it's definitely worth doing the exterior scans, exterior tests, but what we do is we focus on that assume breach, because we're going to reduce costs in testing. It's not going to take us a week to fish our way in. Like you can send an email that says, don't click this link, it's malicious. And statistically, someone will click on that link. So we'll do assume breach there. Like we said, phishing works. It might be insider threat scenario. Maybe someone's brought in a USB. Actors could use a 0-day to get on your network. And then there could be misconfigurations, or you could already be breached. So that's some reasons why we do that. The other thing The cost of a 0-day, by the way, right now, Windows remote code execution 0-click is $1 million. So if someone's asking you that you should exploit your way on with a 0-day, you might want to ask for $1 million, or you might want to say, well, if we're going to develop this 0-day, we probably should sell it because we've just developed something that the company can make money off of. Or, you can do the responsible thing and report it to the vendor as well. How do we get this into the purple team cycle? Well, we take that CTI. What are the adversaries doing? We then analyze and organize it. We also take the procedures, we map them to the tactics and techniques that are in the attack framework. We do a discussion. We usually, during a discussion, we go over what are the expectations so that we can measure those and also get approval. If you're ever going to do anything on a network that looks somewhat malicious, you might want to get approval. And then finally, after we have that approval, we emulate the attack. And then, like we said before, we want to fix those gaps in detections or preventions where we see them. And then that's step 5. And then finally, we want to validate any changes that we've done. So we redo this. And then we also do variations so that we can validate that detections have resilience. So if you're just starting out on this, Atomic Red Team, I think we've talked about it a lot. If you don't know what it is, highly recommend checking it out. It's a great place to start. If you're like, I'm just a one-man purple team kind of right now, maybe I'm a SOC tier 2 person or a SOC tier 3 analyst, and we're starting to dabble in some purple teaming or some detection validation. So Atomic Red Team can definitely help with that. Here we see for this specific sub technique, they actually have a bunch of different atomic tests over here on the right. And what you can do is you can go to this nice GUI, you can click it, you can copy and paste the script that they have, and then you can execute it. Another way you can do this is they actually made a framework called Invoke Atomic Test. And here you just invoke the atomic test. You type in the technique ID that you want to test, and then you give it the test numbers, and then it executes it. I mean, that's great. We're starting to get data in our pipeline. We're starting to get that data through our own unique security stack. And that's what a lot of it is about, is just getting that data through the security stack. So there's just some ways that you can start out. And then what we look at here is, okay, we've tested it. Do we have logging? Did we get an alert or not? If we do we need to adjust it? Once again, are we testing response? If you're just starting out, you probably aren't ready to test the response cycle yet. You want to make sure you have the alerts first, and then we can go into testing the response later. Like we said before, we want to variate. Oftentimes we say, what happens if there's no alert? Well, you can run your test against a stack with Sigma. So if you build out a test box, you can actually have it bounce against the Sigma rule set. Within SCYTHE, we actually give these recommendations. So if we're running an emulation with SCYTHE, it'll give the Sigma rule recommendation. And this is just an example of who am I goes to the Sigma rule. And with that logic, what we're able to do is we're able to do the Sigma converter. And so the Sigma rule detection logic goes into, CrowdStrike, Carbon Black, Splunk, FireEye, Elastic, and more. And Sigma is a generic language that can be converted into those solutions. So we kind of equate it. It's kind of like Yara, but Yara is for tools. That's for the actual scanning the files. Snort is for traffic, whereas Sigma is for SIM logs and procedures. There's a free GUI out there to actually translate these for you if you need to. The Sigma project has a bunch of different tools. They have like a Python script that you can run. But here, a lot of people who are just starting out, they like a nice GUI. So uncoder.io, you can put the Sigma rule in over here, and then you select, in this instance, we went from Sigma to Carbon Black, and we hit translate, and it translates the rule for us. So that's great. But I've done this atomic testing, and maybe my threats aren't actually doing what the atomics are doing. So that's something to consider. So in this instance, we said that, hey, we need to test T1057. Maybe I read a report that said, hey, we need to test 1057. So I ran the atomic test for it, right? But what if my adversary is using native API and that's not in the atomic test? So that's where it comes down to, all right, we can't just color process discovery as like deep blue because we ran 3 atomic tests, right? We have to make sure that we have that threat understanding so that we can validate against that. And what is a threat? It really comes down to who has hostile intent against us. Do they have an opportunity? And then do they have capability? And that makes a threat. Hostile intent can vary. There's people who want to make money. There's people who want to cause impact. There's people who want to conduct espionage. So there's a bunch of different hostile intents out there. The greater the hostile intent, the greater the threat. The greater the capability, the greater the threat. This is why APTs, especially the most advanced ones, they can have targets that they really need to get on, and they can have advanced capabilities. So that makes them a huge threat. And opportunity, that's something that we can kind of control as defenders because we can do things like patching. If I have unpatched Exchange servers out on the internet, that's a huge opportunity for a bunch of adversaries. So now my threats grow. Because someone with low hostile intent, maybe though, because of the huge opportunity, it's now a growing threat. So once you've identified your adversaries, you gather the threat intelligence and you extract the TTPs. And that's what we do when we do adversary emulation campaign building. We go out, we gather, and we extract down to the procedure level. Because if we go back, let me just go back real quick. If we only go to the technique level, then we don't know what to do. We have to know that they're using native API. And that comes to the Pyramid of Pain by David Bianco. Great guy, did a great talk this past year at, what was that? Augusta B-Sides. If you get a chance, Augusta B-Sides, David Bianco, amazing talk, 10-year anniversary of the Pyramid of Pain. But we want to focus on suspicious activity. And we're focusing at the top of this pyramid, right? Because we're allowing our vendors to focus on hash values, IPs, network artifacts, tools. We need to focus on, because of living off the land, binaries and scripts, LawBAS, the way that attackers are blending into environments now, we need to focus on those behaviors at the top of the pyramid. And when we're talking about the top of the pyramid, we're talking about getting up to those procedures. So in this example, all right, the tactic is credential access, but how did they do it? And then we get to the technique. Okay, they dumped LSAS. There was just a recent someone published on the internet a blog. I think it was like 50 ways of dumping LSAS. So there's a lot of different ways of dumping LSAS. And the thing is depending upon one of those 50 ways, it might be blocked, it might be alerted, it might not be alerted, or it might change the detection opportunity. So we need to know those procedures that the adversary is actually doing. And why do we do that? Because people have training, they have tools, they have proved actions, they have run books, and they have habits. There's humans behind this, and humans have habits and run books. In this example, a Conti actor, an operator, they actually took the exact command line from the run book and pasted it in. And if you look at the last bit of text in this document or in the screenshot, it says IP. And they're supposed to fill the IP in with an actual IP address. So they have run books, and sometimes they don't even fill in what they're supposed to fill in as far as their variables go. The other thing is, when we look, this was 10 years ago, this APT1 report, we have net local group administrators. They're enumerating the local administrators. And then we see that Conti did it as well. Then we see net group domain admins. They're enumerating domain admins. And Conti was doing that as well. So as defenders in general, we've done a bad job of focusing on procedures, because these are 10-year-old procedures that are still occurring in organizations, and yet they're not raising red flags to stop adversaries before they get to their objectives, before they get to that boom. We can clearly, this is very early. They don't even know who the domain administrators are yet. They don't know where they are. But if we catch them here, then we're going to get them out before they cause that boom. So how do we think about this from looking at procedures? Well, if we want to do some micro tests, here was a release from Microsoft security team. They went over some few procedures, but if we're just starting out, maybe we say, okay, we see MSHTA going to a WAN IP address. Boom, right there, something we can test really quick to make sure that, okay, if this adversary did use a 0-day, we might not be able to detect the 0-day, but we can detect this, such as who am I being piped out to a text document. So that's where we're starting to talk about doing some of that testing. And then as you grow, you start getting to full replication. So here we have an image from the DFIR report, and we actually see user clicks a link.lnk file. They run CMD, WMIC, ipconfig, system info, and it starts going through all these. And that's where we can actually start building out and going through full replication of that. And this is just, there's so many detection opportunities here. And that's why we're saying prevention's nice, detection's a must. And if you look, so these are the ICE ID connections at the top of this. That was the initial connections when the adversary first got in. And then these were automated commands that they ran. So if you have any sort of detection for someone running, say, NL test domain trust, which probably is not typical in your environment, you can catch an adversary very quickly before they actually even do human action on objectives, so to speak. And then that's reducing dwell time. That's going to reduce the boom factor. That's going to reduce cost, and everyone's going to be happy. So the more we can shift from boom to detecting early on of these common actions that we're seeing amongst adversaries, then the better we will be as defenders. What does this look like? Well, here we have an ICE ID initial access discovery. We see ipconfig/all in our testing against the major EDR. There was no alert, but we have a Sigma recommendation. And then for procedure, we have system info, another one with not an alert. Who am I/groups was a low level alert. By the way, how many people actually respond to a low level alert? I don't know if y'all have like the raise hand button or something, but if y'all do, please raise your hand, because I don't know anyone who responds to a low or informational alert. Maybe once they're all correlated in like a package of 20 of them. But anyways, so what we can recommend here is that we can tune the alert for our environment, and then we can raise it to a critical so it actually gets a response. And then we see netconfig workstation, still, once again, no alert. And then net use, no alert. So we ran these 5 initial automated discovery procedures that comes from ICE ID, and this would not trigger any sort of response from an organization that's using this EDR. So it's one of those areas like, okay, let's get in there. Let's get our hands a little dirty with some detection engineering, and let's actually take control of our security stacks ourselves and tune it up so that we can respond to adversaries before boom. And I think with that, it's now time for me to hand it over to my man, Jim, and he will go over some of the product roadmap. Take it away, Jim.
Cool. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, as you know, we have said for a long time, knowing where you stand, and as a CISO, one of the big things I always challenged my team was moving from believing to knowing. You know, that we believe that, you know, our EDR or our tech stack is doing something, but until you actually run those tests and run them on a continuous basis, you don't know that you're able to detect on adversary activity on your network. And again, it's one of those areas where we control the home field advantage. You know, the adversary can only use the protocols, can only use the binaries that we put on it, unless they want to be even noisier and try to download, you know, their tool set. But you know, they tend not to, because it's easier to live off the land. But anyway, so thanks, Chris, for going over the purple team. And what I wanted to talk about, I'm excited to give everybody sort of a sneak peek of things coming in 2023 to SCYTHE. Probably the biggest thing is building out add-on packages to help the red teams, the blue teams, and the purple teams. So Chris walked through the purple team exercise process, and there are a lot of steps to it. Right now, we've got the purple team framework defines it, so you can roll this out and conduct purple teams yourself. And we're going to operationalize that and create a package that will help walk you through that. So let's just jump into some discussions on each of these add-on packages. Next slide, please. So with the Purple Team package, it's going to allow us to leverage integrations. So we're building integrations out to popular EDR and SIM tools. So instead of manually going through the logged, detected, alerted stages, we'll be able to go pull that information directly from your EDR and your SIM and help you score that. Because again, one of our goals here is to help you run these Purple Teams on a more consistent basis. And so we're going to reduce the labor required to go through and identify all of the campaign steps and help you identify which ones you're detecting. Then that gives you a place to start with your detection engineering. So we're also able to start collecting mean time scores. So as a CISO, one of the things I told my board when I got the job is, they wanted to see the usual stats they get from the big accounting firms of viruses and firewall blocks and things that are pretty meaningless metrics because, they tell you what's happening to you, but nothing you can really affect or have impact on. So the two things I was very focused on was mean time to detect and mean time to remediate. And those are things that you can derive from a Purple Team exercise, and you can gauge your team's improvement over time. And so we'll be have dashboards and reports in there that will let you rerun a Purple Team exercise over and over again and track the improvement of your team, and then be able to demonstrate to the CISO and to your board or CEO of the value of the investment in not only the tech stack, but in training the people. And last thing I'll point out with the Purple Team exercises is we're starting to see more and more control frameworks and audit requirements where the auditors are looking for evidence that the blue teams are being trained in real world live fire exercises. And so this is an area where you'll be able to run the exercises and have that evidence then to provide to whether it's your cybersecurity underwriter or to your security framework auditor. And speaking of audits, next slide. Oh, actually I missed one. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. I've got a screenshot in here about some of the EDR. So one of the cool things also that we'll be adding in, Chris talked about the Sigma events, but we're also putting the MITRE mitigations in for the campaign steps. So we will be giving you a place to start instead of just handing a stack of information to the blue team and say, good luck trying to find this. We're going to provide that information that gives you a place to start that detection engineering process. Okay, next slide. There we go. Now we're into the control validation module. It's said fairly frequently that compliant companies get hacked all the time, which is very true. But non-compliant companies also go out of business. So compliance is something that we have to do. And I always like to tell people that compliance is the floor. It doesn't tell you, it's not a goal where you stop. It is where you start from, and then you improve from there. So we're going to be providing a series of individual control tests that are tied to multiple frameworks. We're going to start with the three you see here first: ISO, the CIS top 20, and CMMC/NIST 80171, and let you run tests across all one or more endpoints. And the cool thing is that we'll actually help collect evidence, because one of the key things with control validation is you need to prove to your audit team that your controls are designed correctly and that they're operating correctly. So by running the commands, getting the results, we'll be able to pull that evidence and then create and put that into a report. Okay, next slide, please. And then the last package is we're going to be expanding on what's already in the core product in terms of threat emulation by providing a lot more analytics in the threat emulation add-on to map things across campaigns, across TTPs. So instead of looking at a very campaign-specific focus, you'll be able to look at individual TTPs, individual campaigns, or devices across multiple campaign runs. So this allows us to do drift reporting and show how things are changing over time in an environment. We'll also be bundling this with a premium threat catalog that will have more sophisticated and more up-to-date threat campaigns that our analytics team is building out. And then we'll be looking at some modules that we'll be adding into the capability and communication modules as part of this package. All of these packages are going to come with a bundle of services in the training area, as well as semi-annual check-ins where we'll be able to come in and run exercises across all three of these use spaces. But the real goal is to get you using the product faster and help you, focus your activity, because time is one of our most valuable resources, and we want to get you to a point where you can use the product and derive actionable results out of it. Okay, and I think we're on to our last slide. There we go. Back to you, Chris, on the framework.
Sounds good. All right, so we have a framework out there, a bunch of different contributors. George Orchias was one of the major drivers of it. Once again, it's a framework. One of the things, by the way, is with frameworks, they're not the law of the land, so to speak. So adapt what works for your organization. Oftentimes frameworks are built by large organizations with large budgets and large teams, so on and so forth. So with any framework, take what you can use within your organization, adapt it to your organization. Every organization is unique. They all have their own politics to work out. They all have their own teams, and what's responsibility of one team in one organization could be a different team's responsibility in a different organization. So adapt frameworks for your organization. That's just one thing I want to drive home with this, but that's going to be available at SCYTHE.io/PTEF. Let me go ahead and type that out into chat.
Yeah, and real quick, and Bryson mentioned this also in the keynote, that once you start getting some experience with the Purple Team framework, expand the audience. It isn't just red and blue. Bring your networking team in, because one of the things I found as a CISO, your customer support, your help desk team, your network team, your server operations teams, they're busy trying to keep things up and running. They'll may be aware of certain things with security, but once they actually see things running live in their environment, they get religion. They understand, that could never happen, and you show them it does. Then all of a sudden, you've got a partner now that's going to work with you on the ops team.
100%. All right, let's dive over to Q&A. All right, the first one is: do you differ methodologies when testing defenders versus testing tech? If so, how? I think that's a really good one. But the thing that I come down to, let me see if I can grab that slide here. Yeah, so because we're testing based on the procedures that we know our adversary is conducting, the methodology is going to be the same. So I need to see that the IP config /all will trigger an alert, or the NL test /domains trust will trigger an alert and response. Now, the one thing that you can start varying within the methodology is timing. So maybe we do want to test not just necessarily what alerts are tripping, but how our EDR ends up correlating those into an actual incident or event, or whatever the terminology that they use is. And then we can start playing around with that. So maybe within our CTI, we see that these commands are spaced out every 10 seconds. Okay, well, maybe we can space that out every 15 seconds. We want to vary. We want to vary the timing of it, and also we want to vary the procedures, and also maybe the specific pattern of the procedures, because that can change as well. So that's my take on it. I don't know if anyone else has anything to throw in there for that.
Yeah, I think you're measuring a different thing when it comes to the tech stack and the human beings. And one is was it detected? Was an alert fired? Those are all the technical aspects of it. But then the key thing, and Chris mentioned earlier, does it get flagged as a false positive? So yes, you tend to use the same campaign to evaluate both parts of the process. Did the alert get fired, and then was that alert properly handled by the SOC once it was showed up on their console?
Yep. And someone also asked, can you add custom threat actors? And the answer to that is absolutely. And you should. The thing is everyone has their own visibility. No one has complete visibility into collecting all intelligence across all threat actors. Some may have better visibility than others, but at the end of the day, one of the best ways to know where you stand for your organization is understanding your threats. Yep. And researching what's attacking you right now, or what potentially could attack you in the future.
Yeah, and one of the things I can't stress enough is join your local industry ISAC. I was a big contributor and part of the National Defense ISAC, and we got more valuable information from that ISAC than DoD, DHS, and it was definitely more timely because it was competitive companies being attacked, putting information out there saying we're seeing this right now, and that allowed us to know not only what the threat actors were doing, but what TTPs were being thrown at, in my case, the defense business, but all the other ISACs, whether it's FS ISAC or the multi-state ISAC, are great tools for helping you identify, who's trying to attack you and what TTPs are most prevalent in those threat actors.
Oh yeah, of course. And then someone else also asked, at which point in the purple teaming process do you look into production logs to figure out whether potential alert logic is viable at scale and won't, because of excessive noise and false positives? I mean, I think that's right off the bat. Like, to me, I'm not going to have my testing pipeline go into some other pipeline. Let's see if we can get back to that. Oh, we're going way, there we go. So when we're talking about that purple team process, that's step 4. We want that going into our existing pipeline because we want to validate things like, is it actually going to our SIM in an appropriate time frame? Is our EDR taking 12 hours to get to our SIM? We want to validate that. So we want it already in the pipeline. So yeah, definitely start there, because also too, it's going to be kind of a bit of a pain to rebuild any sort of pipeline you have in a testing environment, unless you're a very large organization that can actually build out kind of a dev, test, prod environment. Typically, it's just best to go ahead and get that data generated through your pipeline and that initial go. So that's what I would say. And then you can start figuring out, okay, how much is the tuning effort for this? And that's something that I'm working on is, okay, we can API call into, say a CrowdStrike or Carbon Black or whatever it is. So we know the alert that was tripped. We can see that it's a low, but then we can also go back and say, okay, how often does this trip across the organization? Okay, what's usually the parent process for that? If we query the parent processes of that alert across the organization, we find out that there's 2 common ones that can be tuned out. That's a quick win. So it just depends, and it's trying to gather those metrics on, okay, how many hosts actually trip that alert? What are the parent processes, users, so on and so forth, to help and grab that data, so to speak, in those statistics, so that we can then be effective and quickly tune alerts.
Yeah, and real quick, and this is an area for you to work closely with your ops teams, because they may be doing something, legitimate, whether it's IP config or using something that we're looking at that would generate, Microsoft Health alerts is one that will flood your SIM. But if you can go to your ops team and say, hey, let's change the way that you're, executing this particular command, then it makes it harder for the adversary to try to hide in that, and it's easier for you to rewrite your detection rules so it's not generating unnecessary false positives.
Yeah, and to add to that, I would say never let good enough prevent you, because maybe if we know that ICE-ID is doing IP config/all, and I know that it's going to take me a week to tune IP config in my organization, okay, clearly IP config may not be the best detection opportunity for us, but hey, we can get a little bit of a win with IP config/all if no one in our organization does that. So we have to kind of critically think about this, of what detection coverage we want. Sometimes, it doesn't have to be the best detection logic to get us somewhere a bit better than where we already are.
Yep, make today better than yesterday.
All right, let's see what else we have. We did the custom threat actors.
Yeah, the EDR question, I think, is a good one.
If you have it up, go ahead and shoot it my way.
Yeah, so the question was, with something super black box like EDR, how do you maximize time spent testing behaviors without spending all of your time covering stuff that EDR will likely catch or isn't worth the risk, and you always test everything? So, the ML rules that are in all the EDRs today, that may or may not fire. So, what do you test, and how do you, look at that EDR. So you're maximizing the value of your purple team exercise.
That's where that threat inform comes in, right? We want coverage of what our adversaries are known to do now. And then once we get that coverage, we can start thinking about where will they go. So at least have coverage of the known knowns before you get into the known unknowns,
Right.
so to speak. And the thing is you might assume that your EDR is likely to catch that. And I've been on many of these calls where, yep, it's going to catch that. And then we start going through and it still hasn't caught it. So it's one of those things where the only way you know where you're actually standing is to test. So I would say that assumptions are just that. They're assumptions. And in the world of defense, and I think, speaking up to the CISO level, they want to actually have validations. So I think validations are huge. So even if we think that they're likely to catch it, we still need to validate that, I believe.
Yep, agreed. And Katrina continues with asking the really good questions. So her question is, how do you ensure that your organization's security policies and procedures meet NIST standards, and how do you incentivize employees to take part in training and security awareness? Yeah, well, you just defined my job as a CISO, and what took me 10 years to try to get traction on. There's no secret sauce on policies and procedures other than literally going clause by clause. Hopefully you've got a GRC team. If you're a one-man shop and you don't have a GRC team, there are some tools out there and companies that have NIST compliant policies that you can use as a baseline to start from. But yeah, it's difficult to make sure that all your policies are there and that you're not flooding your employees. You don't want to write 100 policies. I'm a huge believer of policies should be no more than 3 to 5 pages long. If it's longer than that, it's a procedure. It's not a policy. And keep them short, and that way you will get people to read them and refer back to them. And incentivize training. We did all types of things in my previous job where we'd put links in there with gift cards or other Easter eggs in policies. And have people read them, and if they got to that and saw something, or they got to the end of it and they were the first one, well, they were able to claim a gift card or swag from the company store. So you can create those games or gamify it to a certain extent to get people to take the training and to read the policies.
Yep. We when I was at General Dynamics OTS, we would have the quick draw. So the person who could report the fish the fastest, whoever got the quickest response time on that, it was like a big 50 cal or something that OTS had produced, some sort of like memorabilia thing. But then the other thing too that I want to highlight here is training is great, but I think as security professionals, it's up to us to have those controls. So while we train users not to click those links, okay, can we go in and can we block Excel files from spawning macros, or can we block ISOs from being mounted? So how are those phishing attacks operating right now, and what controls can we put in place so that we can almost put safeguards around our users? So even when they do fail, look, it's not their fault. We've set up a good environment that allows them to fail because we know that they eventually something will happen. But it's up to us to be there as professionals to support them and allow them to operate effectively without worry that a greater breach is going to happen because we put those controls in place to support our users. All right, I think we're 1 minute over?
Yep.
All right.
I see Beth with the hopefully it's
no
not the
plan
site. Hopefully
survives
it's just
first contact. No schedule survives first contact.
That's right. Yeah, as I say, given this is a Friday, I've always said that anytime you see exe or excel.exe launching command.exe in a process tree, you're going to have a bad weekend.
All right. Well, thank you for all of that, Jim and